Hey guys, so in 1939, World War II begins with the invasion of Poland. So Germany invades from one side, and then the Soviet Union will invade from the other, and they will crush the poor Poles in a vice. Now, Britain and France will declare war against Germany, but not against the Soviet Union. This is in part because they can't take on the armies of both different countries. So they pick the smaller guy who is closer to them. Secondly, they feel that the fascist and the communist don't like each other much, really. I mean, they do, but they really don't. So maybe at some point they will have a falling out, which is indeed what happens. So, there you go. But regardless, after Poland falls, we enter into a period called the Phony War. And what's that all about? We're supposed to have entered into war, but the belligerents don't really interact with each other for multiple months. Then all of a sudden they do, because Hitler is on the move. And when Hitler gets on the move, he's going to have something called the Blitzkrieg, which is going to be a coordinated effort, a mechanization of how his strategy, in which he uses his tanks and his planes and his jeeps and his infantry all together. So he's going to coordinate these different aspects of his forces in a way that had not happened before. And this Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, is going to just make other countries fall right in front of it. It's like early shock and awe. Dominoes, they are just collapsing. Boom, 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 boom. And even the Maginot Line doesn't matter to Hitler, in part because he goes through Belgium, as they had during World War I. The Maginot Line was a defense line that the French had built along its border, thinking that it would be impenetrable from attack. But it's kind of like the arrogance of the Titanic. Nothing is really impenetrable, so you've got to think of other stuff too. At some point, the French and the British both have to fall further and further and further back until the British almost lose their entire army at a place called Dunkirk. Now, you may have seen that movie. There was a movie called Dunkirk, which was kind of fun, but if you didn't know the history, you probably had no idea what was happening in it, because it was all from a single soldier's perspective as he's running onto the beaches. It's still a pretty good flick if you want to stream it while you're at home, but what was actually going on, the Nazis were moving across France and crushing the heck out of it. And they were about to destroy the British military when Hitler issued something that is still argued about, like no one knows what the dude was smoking, called the HALT order, HALT. And what was that? So he tells his tanks, halt. And they're like, why? We're about to take it all, win the game. We're about to pass go. What's the deal? And different historians have different thoughts on this. So one thought is that Hitler really admired Britain and didn't want to humiliate it. That doesn't really ring true to me, because even though he probably did admire the British Empire for having dominated so much of the world, he hated Winston Churchill, and I don't think he cared about other people's feelings very much. Secondly, there's an idea that Hermann Göring, who was in charge of his Air Force, went to Hitler and said, hey, you don't need to expend those resources with your tanks. I can just strafe everyone from the air and dominate. And this is a little bit more plausible because Göring was very much in Hitler's inner circle, and he was kind of a glory hound. He'd been at the beer hall putsch, so he goes way back with this guy. They're like super tight. But what Göring actually does is stops the war from ending right then. And I say thank God, right? Because, have you ever, nothing against anyone who's German. I lived in Germany. It is a lovely, lovely country. But I'm glad I'm not speaking German. It's super hard. Anyway, what happens is Winston Churchill has all of his army pinned down in Dunkirk, and he's able to marshal civilians in the UK who will take their ships, move them across the English Channel in something called Operation Dynamo, pick up soldiers and take them back to Britain where they could regroup. If that hadn't happened, again, game over. But I also don't want you to think, we also tease the French a lot about how quickly they fell. They deserve a little bit of ribbing, between friends. But they do give Britain enough time to evacuate. There were many French soldiers who fought very valiantly, and also they're going to have an extremely robust French resistance throughout the war. So we can only make so many jokes about France, okay? So Churchill is in charge of Britain, and his forces are going to be evacuated, and he's going to give a very famous speech. And this is what he says, if you will let me read a little bit of it to you. So even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen or may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island, or a large part of it, were subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to meet the liberation of the old. The new world? What? Who is Winston Churchill talking to here? So, yes, he is bolstering his own people. The British have a lot to carry. The British will be the only people. Churchill will be standing in the gap between the Western democracies and Adolf freaking Hitler. Guys, I gotta just get this off my chest real quick, okay? I'm just gonna say it publicly on YouTube to my great gathering of 5 subscribers. Winston Churchill, who has graffiti on the pedestal of his statue now in London, was the only guy standing in the gap against the fascist. Was he an imperialist? Yes. Yes, he was. Was he a racist? Yes. Yes, Winston Churchill was a racist. He grew up in a Victorian age in which the world was completely different. Should we say, oh, okay, that's fine, Winston Churchill? No, we can criticize Churchill for both his visions of imperialism, his desire to keep the empire intact, his view of other peoples. He does, by the way, apologize to the people of India, though he's also fine with subjugating them. I'm not gonna candy coat it. Winston Churchill had some visions of the world that we in the present would not like. But Winston Churchill stood in the gap. It was him, Winston or Adolf. And frankly, I know exactly who I want heading my team between those two. Winston, all day long, man. I'll smoke a freaking cigar with you. Okay? And here he is asking, he is begging, he's using all of his rhetorical power to try and bring in the greatest country, the greatest industrial power to help, because we were not. We were not helping. Well, we were helping a little bit, but we had the ambassador to England, Joseph Kennedy, that would be JFK's dad, saying that, you know, we need to evacuate everything from Britain. We need to take all of our stuff home. We need to just go ahead and write off what was our former mother country. Hitler's going to rule, so let's just get used to that and don't worry about it. Now, to his credit, FDR will not listen to his ambassador, Joseph Kennedy. He will support Winston Churchill, but he's going to do so in soft ways. We have these things called the Neutrality Acts, which are based on some weird idea that the only reason the United States ever engages in war is to make money. That's the only reason. There can never be any other reason. So the Neutrality Acts hamstrung people in Congress or people in anyone who dealt in arms with selling things to someone like Britain, who was fighting our enemy, Hitler. And FDR is going to have to be extremely creative to work around those Neutrality Acts so he can still help his friend Winston Churchill fight the Nazis without us being engaged and without him breaking the law. So FDR was really good at working around it. The Lend-Lease Acts and cash and carry are essentially what that is about. But regardless, when Winston Churchill is giving that speech, and even after the Battle of Great Britain, the Battle of Britain, where you have like the Blitzkrieg goes and it just absolutely bombs London, it's called the Blitz. 90% of Americans want nothing to do with World War II. We're like, that's your problem. I mean, I'm sorry for you, but we're just not concerned with that. And that is in part because we had organizations in the United States that were extremely isolationist in nature. Organizations like America First, which was led by Charles Lindbergh, a guy who had been a hero because he had flown the Spirit of St. Louis across the ocean during the 1920s, and he was very good looking, and we like good looking people for whatever reason. It just is what it is. And he had had a baby kidnapped and murdered, Lindy's baby. The story of that is quite tragic, and no one wanted to touch Charles Lindbergh and his America First, and everyone was persuaded that World War II was not a good deal. And if you told us that Hitler was killing Jews, well, quite frankly, during Wilson's World War I effort, you told us that the Germans were Huns and horrible monsters, and we just lost a lot of people, and really it was just propaganda. So we don't listen to you now. Does anyone want to help stop Hitler? One guy, I mean, FDR is kind of helping, but he's not like charging in there. Another guy, his name was Theodore Geisel, and he drew my favorite political cartoon of all time. So this lady is reading Adolf the Wolf, and she says to her children, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children, and it really didn't matter. Theodore Geisel was, of course, Dr. Seuss. And he wanted the United States to get involved because he understood what Hitler was. What gets us involved? Is it Theodore Geisel pulling us into war? No. What was Lucky Lindy, Charles Lindbergh, able to keep us out of war? No. The big thing that pulls us into war is that Japan attacks us on December 7th, 1941 at a place called Pearl Harbor because we were standing in the way of them getting resources, and they were scared that we would engage at some point. Germany, in a move that again is unfathomable, declares war on us, even though they didn't have to, because the Axis powers were not completely coordinated, and we are now engaged in World War II.